Your friends, it's Mr. Robert O'Driscoll. I'm Robert O'Driscoll, our Consul here in San Francisco, Ireland's Consul General in San Francisco. I want to welcome you to the third in a series of 4 speaker events organised by the Consulate, marking St. Bridget's Day 2022. The theme of these conversations is Women Disruptors Throughout History. You can find the previous 2 talks on the Consulate's YouTube channel at Ireland in SF. Today's speaker event reflects on events that were at once personal and local, which had national and international significance. As you remember, an Irish woman in California, Mary Mooney, affectionately known as Mother Mooney from Mayo, and the mothers of the Scottsboro boys in Alabama, who together launched a nationwide and international campaign to seek justice for their boys. We are honoured to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Maurice Casey, now at Queen's University and formerly the Department of Foreign Affairs Historian in Residence at the Epic Museum in Dublin. We are also delighted to co-present this event with our colleagues and friends in the Consul General of Ireland in Atlanta. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our new Consul General in Atlanta, Caoimhe, and welcome her to deliver opening remarks. Go to Mila Mahagwith.
Díomh Chomhairde agus fáilte isteach. A very warm welcome to you to this special event brought to you in collaboration with our friends, with Robert and colleagues in the Consulate General of Ireland in San Francisco. As Robert said, my name is Caoimhe and I'm Ireland's new Consul General in the Southeast United States, based in Atlanta, but covering 7 states, including Alabama. And as you'll hear later in the fascinating lecture by Dr. Maurice Casey, today's event focuses on the tragic story of a group of Black teenage boys from Alabama, known as the Scottsboro Boys, and how an 84-year-old Irish woman called Mary Mooney became a leading figure in their campaign for justice. The month of February is a special one in Irish calendars because it marks the beginning of spring, building on the ancient pagan customs of Imbolc, later St. Bridget's Day, in celebration of the goddess of creativity, wisdom, poetry and healing. Bridget represents the movement of the year from darkness to light and carries with her all the optimism of spring. In Ireland, her feast day, the 1st of February, is associated with the celebration of women's creativity. And of course, February has a particular resonance here in the US as Black History Month, an opportunity both for celebration and importantly for remembrance. Today, we're bringing both threads together in marking the role played by a remarkable Irish woman abroad in the tradition of St. Bridget, while paying our respects to the victims of a dark episode in the history of the US, exploring how the two came to be intertwined in the most unexpected ways. There is a rich theme, as we know, to be explored in how campaigners for justice and rights on both sides of the Atlantic joined forces at different moments in the shared history of the US and Ireland, whether in Frederick Douglass's visit to famine-stricken Ireland in 1845, or the influence of the civil rights movement of the 1960s on Irish leaders like John Hume. So Robert and I are really grateful to Dr. Casey for sharing with us this illuminating research. And I'd also like to say a special thank you to our colleagues in San Francisco for bringing us on board so that we can share this really important story with viewers in the Southeast. So Gur Magwith, thank you, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey everyone, it's great to be talking to you all this evening. My name is Dr. Maurice J. Casey, and I'm the current Department of Foreign Affairs Historian in Residence at Epic, the Irish Emigration Museum in Dublin. I'm delighted to be participating as part of this series, Women Disruptors Throughout History, as part of the Irish Consulate in San Francisco's St. Bridget's Festival celebrations. The topic I'm going to speak about this evening is a really remarkable one, and one that I've been researching for many years. In fact, one that I was researching back in 2018 when I first spent some time in San Francisco on a Fulbright scholarship from 2018 to 2019. And that was also the first trip when I got to meet the brilliant team at the San Francisco consulate. So a shout out to everyone at the team, Robert O'Driscoll, Elizabeth Creeley, and Dearne O'Brien in particular, who worked hard to try and get me over to San Francisco to give this talk, but unfortunately the pandemic had other plans. So even though this is a pre-record, I'm still going to do that little awkward thing where I go about sharing my screen. So hopefully you are now viewing my slides. So the title of my talk, Mother Mooney and the Scottsboro Boys, Irish and African American solidarity in the 1930s. So what I'm talking to you about is a single event that had an Irish woman at the centre that took place 90 years ago. And this event was called the Scottsboro-Mooney Tour. The story I'm about to outline for you is a history of the largest scale 20th century campaign that prominently featured Irish American and African American activists on shared platforms, particularly women activists. Indeed, this idea of a shared platform between white and Black women activists was really one of the mobilizing forces of the campaign itself. And it's a story that has had many important consequences, ranging from Supreme Court rulings to books, movies, and even a musical. And it is in many ways a San Francisco story too. The Irish family at the heart of my talk this evening, the Mooneys, resided in San Francisco, largely because one member of that family was imprisoned in San Quentin prison. This is also a story about one Irish woman who was born in a country still reeling from a cataclysmic famine, whose life in America was one of struggle, first personal struggle and then international struggle. And this is also the story of 9 African-American teenagers collectively known as the Scottsboro Boys, whose stories became entwined in a curious way with that of this Irish woman named Mary Mooney. There are many relevant places where we can begin our story. We could begin it in rural Ireland, in the aftermath of the Great Famine. We could begin it in early 20th century Chicago, in San Francisco, or even in revolutionary Petrograd in the wake of the Russian Revolution. But I wanted to begin with an advert placed in an Irish Republican newspaper in January 1921. So here is the advert. It's advertising subscriptions for a new Black radical magazine. And in a declarative statement and eye-catching phrasing, it states, "Coordination will win the day, will break the tyrant's hold. Divided we fail, united we win, then let's unite. We are making your cause our own." The advert was for this new Black journal, The Crusader, and the advert itself was likely placed by the Crusader's editor, Cyril V. Briggs, an African diaspora radical from the Caribbean island of Nevis, who was particularly inspired by the Irish nationalist cause. In addition to editing a journal of Black political thought and culture, Briggs was the founding figure of a radical organization, the African Blood Brotherhood. The Brotherhood was a secretive Black Marxist organization that operated within the world of radical left groups that emerged in the wake of the First World War in the US and Europe. Historians suggested that Briggs's idea to create the African Blood Brotherhood was an homage to the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood. So looking at this 1921 advert, it raises some questions. So was Briggs able to attract any subscribers in Ireland with this advert? And was his invitation to join in solidarity accepted? Another question that comes to mind is this. What did Briggs mean when he told Irish readers, "We are making your cause our own"? What led a Caribbean journalist in New York to imagine that he shared a cause with people living on an island on the other side of the Atlantic? What was the fuel that fired this expansive political imagination? In moments of great and grave transformations, like our own time and the world of the 1920s and the 1930s, we can awake and find that the future is no longer where we left it. An unexpected and even revolutionary pace of change in the wider world allowed Cyril Briggs to see an opening crack in the global status quo and to believe that there was a shared space that could easily fit what he saw as his own people, the African diaspora, and the cause of Ireland. Remarkably, just over a decade after placing this advert in an Irish newspaper, Cyril Briggs would find himself reporting from a Washington Supreme Court courtroom where an Irish woman and a group of African American women were awaiting a Supreme Court decision, with their sons' lives hanging in the balance. And it's to the story behind that moment that we now turn. On the 25th of March 1931, on a Wednesday morning, a Southern Railroad train departed from Chattanooga, Tennessee, The train was for freight, not for passengers, but in an era of economic immiseration, remember this was the beginning of the Great Depression, the transport infrastructure of the country became a conduit for illicit passengers riding the rails from state to state in search of work. Haywood Patterson, Andy and Roy Wright, and Eugene Williams, 4 Black teenagers from Chattanooga, all friends, joined the train. Elsewhere in the train were 5 other young African Americans: Charlie Weems, Clarence Norris, Olin Montgomery, Willie Roberson, and Ozzie Powell. These 5 did not know one another, nor did they know the 4 from Chattanooga, but from that day forward, their lives would be joined together by a shared personal tragedy that would become the catalyst for an international movement for justice. Also on board the train were a group of white youths. An altercation broke out with many of the white combatants either jumping or being ejected from the slow-moving train. The ejected made their way back to the nearest station, Stevenson, Alabama, and reported to the local authorities. As James Acker notes in his valuable account of the Scottsboro case, the white traveling workers were traveling illegally on the train themselves, but, quote, they undoubtedly and correctly perceived that the authorities would consider their treatment at the hands of Black youths as the more serious affront to Alabama law. As they made their complaint, the train approached and passed through Scottsboro, Alabama, 20 miles outside of Scottsboro. The train was there met with dozens of armed white men who made their way through the train cars searching for Black passengers. After being found and placed at gunpoint, the 9 African-American youths left on the train were tied by rope and placed in the back of a truck. Initially, Haywood Passenger, one of the Scottsboro boys, was told by a deputy that they were being charged with assault and attempted murder. Hours later, at Scottsboro jail, the 9 were told that they were in fact being charged with the rape of 2 white women passengers on the same train. Transpired, the search of the train had found 2 other people traveling illegally on the train, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. In Acker's account of the moment, which I have relied upon here to tell this story, he notes that Bates, quote, either volunteered or else responded affirmatively to a sheriff deputy's question that they both had been raped. News of the accusation spread rapidly, and a lynch mob numbering several hundred gathered outside Scottsboro jail. The National Guard was called in to defend the building and prevent mob violence. The motions of an unjust justice system were now in progress. 4 trials in 4 days in early April 1931, each led to all-white juries finding the defendants guilty of raping the 2 women, Virginia Price and Ruby Bates. 8 of the defendants were sentenced to death. The case of the youngest, Roy Wright, who was only 13 years old, was declared a mistrial because the jury could not decide on life imprisonment or execution. Soon, however, an organization that would prove crucial to the Scottsboro Boys' defense entered the fray, the International Labour Defense. It was a Communist Party-linked organization committed to defending the rights of what it termed the prisoners of the, quote, class war. Samuel Leibovitz, pictured here with the Scottsboro 9, was assigned by the International Labour Defense to the case. The communist commitment to racial equality, which was a pillar of the party's platform in these years, encouraged its activists to immediately get behind the Scottsboro defense, while its militant resistance to any group even more mildly right-wing than itself caused the communists to forcefully attack other groups that were ultimately attempting to help the boys, such as the NAACP, which also sent lawyers to attempt to defend Scottsboro defendants. A key outlet for publicizing the Scottsboro case and the activism of the campaign to save the boys' lives, save them from execution, was the Labour Defender, and that was a journal, the Journal of the International Labour Defense. Interestingly, when this journal first went into print in 1926, its editor was an Irishman named Tom O'Flaherty, pictured here on the left beside Big Bill Haywood. That's a picture taken in Moscow, I think around 1925. And Tom O'Flaherty was one of 11 surviving children in a small cottage on Inishmore, born in Inishmore in the late 19th century, and he was a native Irish speaker who emigrated to the US in his late teens and became a founding member of the US Communist Party. However, by the time of the Scottsboro case, the Labour defender was edited by this man here, William L. Patterson. He was a San Francisco-born African-American lawyer. He was born the son of a formerly enslaved woman, and he came of age in the era of early 20th century feminist labor and African-American organizing in the Bay Area. In his autobiography, Patterson traced his political awakening, particularly his belief that class, more than anything else, was the real dislocation of a divided society. While studying law, Patterson worked at a hotel in San Francisco, and it was here that he encountered a young Irish activist named Rose Murphy. Patterson, in his memoir, recalled how she would often stop. He said, she would often stop in the lobby to talk with me about my studies. And from this Irish revolutionary, I learned that whites oppressed other whites all over the world. Oppression was not determined solely or even chiefly by skin color. One had to look beyond color to reach the core of the matter. So Patterson was narrating here how he drew to the standard Marxist understanding of society's divides. Patterson, as someone who was active in labor organizing and progressive politics in early 20th century San Francisco, inevitably came into contact with the campaign to free Tom Mooney. And this was a campaign for the exoneration of an Irish-American prisoner in San Quentin prison, and it featured commonly on the pages of the Labour Defender. Here's a cover from 1928 showing Tom Mooney marking his 12th year in San Quentin prison for a crime he didn't commit. And Tom Mooney's story is really a rather remarkable one. He was born in 1882 in Chicago to Irish parents. He was the oldest of 3 children born to Bernard and Mary Mooney. Mary Mooney, his mother, had been born in 1849 in rural Mayo. She will become the central character of this talk. Of course, 1849, rural Mayo, that pinpoints her origins as really in the epicenter of the central catastrophe of 19th century Irish history, the Great Famine. Mary Mooney, like so many people of that generation, emigrated. She emigrated at the age of 16. And when she moved to the US, she eventually met an Irish-American man, and who would become her husband, Bernard Mooney. Young Tom, their eldest son, lost his father at the age of 10, and Mary Mooney moved with her children, Tom, Anna, and John, to Holyoke, Massachusetts, and worked in a paper factory to support the family. Tom began working in the paper mill, and he later graduated to foundry work and became involved in trade union activity. So here is an image of some of the family from right to left. That's Anna, Tom's sister, John, his brother, and Mary, his male-born mother. And then on the left is Rena Mooney. And she was a woman who Tom met in 1908, and they married. She was a music teacher from Kansas. Together, Tom and his wife Rena would move to San Francisco in the early 1900s. And it was here in San Francisco that Tom grew more deeply invested in radical activity and radical politics. He made connections with people such as the anarchists Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, the Cork-born Mother Jones, and this radical activity also drew him to the attention of local authorities, and particularly a private detective agency working on behalf of corporate interests in the city. Tom's life is linked to the Preparedness Day Parade, a fatal bombing in July of 1916 in San Francisco, for which he was accused of planting the bomb. 4 days after that bomb exploded, Tom and Rena Mooney were arrested after a raid on their home, and 2 associates of the Mooneys, Israel Weinberg and Warren Billings, were also arrested. The trial of Tom Mooney took place in early 1917, with Tom Mooney being delivered a death sentence by Judge Franklin Griffin in a courtroom where his Irish mother Mary and siblings John and Anna were also present. Rena Mooney, his wife, was acquitted. Soon, the evidence put forth by the prosecution would, however, fall apart as more details came to light. Mooney's death sentence was commuted as a result of campaigns and further evidence, but he remained imprisoned under a life sentence. And perhaps the best indication of just how poorly constructed the case against Tom Mooney comes from a 1955 interview with Mary Gallagher, who was a radical organizer of the interwar era, whose father was from Leitrim. That's something that's very notable about the Tom Mooney case. It involved a lot of prominent Irish American women activists campaigning for his release, not only his mother, people like Mary Gallagher, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Mother Jones as well, all involved in this case. So Mary Gallagher described a meeting that she organized in LA in 1929. And she noted that the principal speaker at this Free Tom Mooney meeting was Judge Franklin Griffin himself. It was such an astonishing thing, Mary Gallagher remembered, that the judge who sentenced Tom Mooney to death would go to the trouble to travel many miles to stand on a platform and declare his belief in Mooney's innocence and in the fact that Mooney had been deliberately framed. By the late 1920s, the campaign to free Tom Mooney was gaining greater momentum and the support of a wide spectrum of progressive opinion. However, it was the Communist Party that would take the most forceful lead on the case. The Labour Defender first featured a Tom Mooney cover in July 1928, and this really was the beginning of a pact made between Tom Mooney and the US Communist Party, essentially that he would rely on their expanding organizational and publishing apparatus to publicize his case, and in turn, they would benefit in prestige from linking up one of the major cases of injustice of the era. Of course, it's important to detail the sort of complexities here around this, particularly for those of us with an understanding of Soviet history in the 1930s. This particular determination with which international communists fought for political prisoners in their own country may seem discordant. At the end of that decade, the Soviet state processed startling numbers of its own citizens on precisely political charges. Communists understood the imprisonment and execution of political prisoners in the Soviet Union as legitimate because these were, in their view, quote unquote, counter-revolutionaries, and thus their incarceration was justified, in contrast with the imprisonment of leftists like Tom Mooney in the quote capitalist world. Yet the expansive political imagination the communists in America, the expansive political imagination that communists in America held was an important prerequisite for what I'm about to describe. Writing on American radicalism and the politics of race in the US South in this period, Glenda Gilmore has argued that the quote presence of a radical left, in this case a communist left, redefined the debate over white supremacy and hastened its end. Gilmore underlines that the small number of communists mattered less than their very existence. She notes that it was communists who stood up to say that Black and white people should organize together, eat together, go to school together, and marry each other if they chose. In early 1932, the International Labour Defence, the group that was now responsible for taking the lead on both the Scottsboro Boys' defence and the campaign to free Tom Mooney, decided to link these two cases together. In the Labour Defence's own words, it wanted to do so to break the walls of racial prejudice. And so an international Scottsboro-Mooney tour was organised, linking one of the most prestigious cases of an imprisoned white radical to the case of working class Black teenagers awaiting execution was itself an anti-racist statement. All of these lives are equally deserving of justice. And it was also at this moment that one of Tom Mooney's staunchest defenders stepped into the spotlight of history, his 84-year-old Mayo-born mother, Mary Mooney, affectionately known to those in the movement as Mother Mooney. And here she is at the center of this picture, pictured on the Scottsboro-Mooney campaign. Mary Mooney was tasked with traveling the world as part of the campaign from San Francisco to Moscow to speak on behalf of her son and the Scottsboro Boys. Writing to a friend in Ireland, Tom Mooney described how the platform would work. Quote, "Mother who does not speak except for saying just a few words," he noted, Then a very brilliant member of the coloured race, Richard Moore, who has been Mother's companion for the past several months, along with another young Jewish girl comrade, do the real talking on the case. Mother's presence is a drawing card, end quote. The quote-unquote brilliant member of the coloured race, Richard B. Moore, was a Caribbean-born communist, while the Jewish girl comrade was, I believe, Miriam Brooks. At the age of 17, Miriam Brooks was given the task of acting as Mary Mooney's chaperone for the tour. Susan Pennybacker, whose work on the international resonances of the Scottsboro campaign has greatly influenced my own, noted in an article co-written with James Miller and Eve Rosenhaft that the Scottsboro campaign orchestrated elaborate and multi-tiered roles for women, following a convention of using the mothers of political prisoners in their sons' campaigns. The opening event of the tour took place on 25th of February 1932, and weary from travel and suffering from illness, Mary Mooney was unable to speak at length. Thousands gathered in the hall, with one reporter describing the audiences as quote-unquote amazingly cosmopolitan. Mary Mooney's appeal was a straightforward one, and she would repeat it on platforms across the US and Europe over the next few months, normally accompanied by a family of the Scottsboro boys, such as Ada Wright, mother of Andy and Roy Wright, or Viola Montgomery, pictured here on Mary Mooney's right, who was the mother of Olin Montgomery. Mary Mooney's demand, and indeed the demand of the Scottsboro mothers, was for the immediate release of their sons from Scottsboro, from death row in Alabama, and San Quentin, respectively. Mary Mooney stated at the first meeting, "I know how the mothers of the Scottsboro boys feel, and I want the fight for my boy Tom to be a fight for the Scottsboro boys too." The tour, of course, scheduled a stop on home territory. In late May 1932, the Daily Worker reported on the California leg of the tour. Mary Mooney spoke in San Diego as solidarity Scottsboro-Mooney protests were held in Fresno and Bakersfield. On May 24th of 1932, Mary Mooney and Richard B. Moore addressed what was described as a huge mass meeting at the Polk Hall in San Francisco, with a follow-up parade the next day in Oakland. A few days later, further meetings were held in Portland and then in Seattle. And in the same month, Tom Mooney wrote a letter from San Quentin prison to W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, the leading Black intellectual of the Anglophone world in the early 20th century. In the letter, Mooney wrote to Du Bois that in the autumn of 1918, in my condemned cell awaiting execution, I read a story in some paper that stamped itself upon my mind so deeply that nothing this side of the grave will ever erase it. The article, Mooney continued, was about a cruel attack upon members of your race, a lynching in Georgia. I want you to know, Mooney wrote, that all my adult life, I have been keenly, warmly, and sympathetically interested in the problems that confront your race, and that I hate the hundreds of wrongs they have suffered with all of my being. Throughout the hectic tour, Mary Mooney was suffering from poor health. Indeed, in Chicago in early June, Mary Mooney suffered a bout of temporary blindness just before she was set to, quote, storm into the Republican National Convention. A report from Chicago described how the mother of Tom Mooney, convicted bomber serving life in San Quentin Penitentiary, was the major threat for disorder at the Republican National Convention today. Mother Mooney balked yesterday by temporary blindness in an attempt to storm into the convention and plead her son's cause before Governor James Rolph Jr. of California and his state delegation. Vowed she would stop the convention proceedings today to tell her story. She was quoted as saying, "My son's freedom is more important than my life," and was noted to have arrived at the convention accompanied by a group of women, including 2 African-American women, likely 2 of the Scottsboro mothers. In Chicago, Mary Mooney also met with Lucy Parsons, pictured here on the right, who was an anarchist radical and the widow of one of the men executed as part of the Haymarket affair. Parsons was a major and fascinating figure of the US left, who claimed Native American and Mexican ancestry. However, later research by Jacqueline Jones revealed that Parsons was in fact the daughter of an enslaved woman born in Virginia in 1851. Lucy Parsons' husband, Albert, was one of the men executed in 1887 after a violent protest in Chicago's Haymarket Square, making him one of the so-called Haymarket Martyrs. And I really like this photo, this news photo on the left, because you have here on the right of this monument, you have Mary Mooney. Then you have on the left, you have Viola Montgomery, mother of the Scottsboro boy, and then in the center you have Lucy Parsons. So you have the history of the Tom Mooney case, the Haymarket affair, and the Scottsboro boys, all represented here by women who are prominent within those campaigns and those historical moments. And Tom Mooney, actually, before he was arrested, would stay at Lucy Parsons' boarding house in Chicago when he was doing organizing activity in the city. The Mooney and Scottsboro cases were not just campaigns, but in many ways cultural phenomena. And the 1932 tour reflected this. In Los Angeles on May 8th, 1932, a play by the major African-American author Langston Hughes was performed. Scottsboro Limited was an agitprop theatre production that ended with the audience chanting "Fight, fight, fight" after the cast rhymed a poem about interracial solidarity. Black and white together will fight the great fight to put greed and pain and the colour lines blight out of the world into time's old night. Together, black and white, up from the darkness into the light. The LA performance of Scottsboro Limited was accompanied by another used poem titled "A Chant for Tom Mooney," which includes the line, "The workers speak the name Tom Mooney, and the sound vibrates in waves from Africa to China, India to Germany, Russia to the Argentine, shaking the bars, shaking the walls, shaking the earth." So you can see how in this play, in this performance, Hughes linked these cases together. As the tour rolled on, the Communist Party of the USA also promoted its electoral ticket in the 1932 general election. William Foster, the Philadelphia race son of an Irish immigrant, was the candidate for president, and James Ford, an African-American worker from Alabama, was the candidate for vice president. Party election literature, seen here on the right, underlined Foster and Ford's ethnic backgrounds and the Ford's family's intimate experience of violent racism in the US South. So the candidates of the election ticket in 1932 then mirrored the unity promoted by the Scottsboro-Mooney campaign, and what you were seeing on the platforms with Mother Mooney and Scottsboro mothers like Ada Wright and Viola Montgomery. This broader atmosphere of the campaign and this idea of breaking down the divides, the racial divides of US society, was reflected elsewhere, and I guess some kind of less suspected places. In February 1933, so that's a year after the Scottsboro-Mooney started, an Irish-American judge in Baltimore, Maryland, threatened to condemn a building in Baltimore known as Tom Mooney Hall. In late 1932, so still during the tour, the building became a space where Black and white progressives could socialize together. The official reason for the building being condemned was that it was unsafe, but a local member of the International Labour Defence claimed that, quote, "it was not until the interracial dances were started this winter," end quote, that the police began to have the building condemned. Through October and into November of 1932, the tour itinerary collided with the case of the Scottsboro boys as it made its way through the Supreme Court. The Afro-Caribbean radical intellectual Cyril Briggs, who we last encountered placing an ad in an Irish Republican newspaper in 1921, wrote to the Labour defender in November 1932 that, quote, "the solidarity of the white workers of the whole world with the persecuted Black masses was dramatically demonstrated in the courtroom itself with the entrance of Mother Mooney, mother of Tom Mooney, victim of another notorious frame-up by the American ruling class," end quote. The Supreme Court case that Briggs was reporting on here had a welcome outcome. Powell versus Alabama determined that the Scottsboro accused had not received fair trials and led to new trials being ordered. Meanwhile, as Mary Mooney pictured here attending the Supreme Court, coming out of the Supreme Court, behind her is William Patterson, the African-American lawyer and editor of International Labor Defense's journal. So while they were in attendance there, Ada Wright, Scottsboro mother, was touring across Europe. And following that Supreme Court ruling, Mary Mooney and her traveling companions headed for Europe to join those who were already touring in Europe. And they were bound first for Moscow. So the centerpiece of the European leg of the tour was Moscow. And ahead of the tour's arrival, a letter was dispatched from Tom Mooney in San Quentin prison to Joseph Stalin. And that letter was then printed in the US Communist press and also translated into Russian and featured in the Soviet daily Pravda. Mary Leader, who was an American expat in the USSR, recalled that a tentative understanding existed that Stalin would see Mother Mooney. Several times during her stay, arrangements were supposedly made for an interview, but each time something interfered. She met with a few officials, and that was all. She was a frail old woman, rather bewildered, who seldom left her hotel. Here's a notebook pictured here on the left, which is kept by Miriam Brooks on the tour, and it suggests some of the officials that Mary Mooney might have met. One likely figure noted here is the head of the Soviet organization MOPR, Yelena Stasova, and she was one of the leading Bolshevik women revolutionaries of the era. Regardless of whom she met or what sites she did or didn't see in Russia, it was certainly a long way from rural Mayo to Moscow. And it's remarkable to just think of these kind of circumstances that would lead to a famine era migrant living this extraordinary life. Upon returning from Russia, Mary Mooney was asked what she thought of Russia, and she replied that she did not like it because it was too cold. On her return from Europe, she attended further meetings, spoke in Berlin, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Paris. In Germany, Scottsboro-Mooney meetings were officially banned by the German government, but Mary Mooney and Ada Wright defied the ban to address thousands. In Paris at the end of December, Mooney spoke at the Salle de la Légion d'Honneur in Saint-Denis. And Mary Mooney stuck out the entire tour, despite the fact that she suffered a medical emergency mid-tour and permanently lost much of her eyesight. As each of his biographers attest, Tom was an undoubtedly dictatorial personality with an unattractive propensity for egotism and selfishness. The source material often reflects how Mooney pushed those closest to him to dedicate every moment of their lives to his release, and was incapable of conciliation or understanding when his family and comrades proved unable to keep up with the strenuous demands he placed upon them. Nevertheless, at least in the case of Mary Mooney, a familial bond ensured that she followed all of his requests, even to the detriment of her own health. So just go to this one. One notable omission from the tour was Ireland. Ada Wright actually had been scheduled to visit and speak in Ireland. However, her visa was refused, and organisers of the tour and campaign believed it was due to Eamon de Valera, then the newly elected head of government in Ireland, and his fear of upsetting his counterparts in the US government. And the Dublin platform was advertised with the likes of the Irish Jewish artist Harry Kernoff, Mary McSweeney, the sister of the Irish Republican Terence McSweeney, and the novelist Padre O'Donnell, all due to attend. And then there is, of course, the question of propaganda, which is rendered particularly acute by this idea that Mary Mooney would have met with Joseph Stalin. The Soviet state, of course, used Scottsboro and the Mooney cases as propaganda, and this can seem unsettling, particularly in a decade that saw the Soviet state arrest and execute hundreds of thousands of innocent people on precisely political charges. That the Soviet state denounced practices in the US that it was complicit in on an even grander scale domestically is undeniable. The more these facts became known to many idealists drawn to the US Communist Party, the more the hypocrisy in many cases grew more unbearable. Events like the Moscow show trials, the Great Terror, and its revelation in 1956 would see scores of activists leave the party, including many inspired to join by campaigns like the Scottsboro-Mooney campaign. And these two images here are of some Soviet propaganda around Scottsboro in particular. On the book on the left is a Soviet publication Wystranie Sudów Lince I Elektrycznego Studia, in the country of the lynch court and the electric chair. And then another poster on the right that features the Scottsboro boys being taken to their execution. But what of the Scottsboro boys themselves in all of this? 9 young African Americans were sitting in jail as thousands rallied for the defense of the world's major ideologies argued over their lives. Thanks to the work of Kwando Kinshasa, who published a collection of letters written by Scottsboro boys, we can hear them in their own words. It is through their writing that, as Kinshasa notes, we come to understand how they viewed themselves not simply as victims, but as protagonists in an honorable cause, their freedom. After the Supreme Court decision, Olin Montgomery wrote to Mary Mooney's traveling companion, William Patterson, to thank him for their work. He wrote, "I am so happy over it until I don't hardly know exactly how to thank them for their kindness, love of us poor ones, but I do appreciate it to the very highest respect." A few months earlier, Andy Wright had wrote to another organizer of the tour how glad he was to receive the news of support from Europe, and he felt as soon as we can gain our freedom again as we should have it. Yet more years of struggle and imprisonment remained ahead for this group brought together by tragedy. We can date the end of Mary Mooney's tour to early 1933, when she met with the then president-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt. In January, Mary Mooney and William Patterson, alongside a delegation, visited FDR to plead Mooney's case. In the California primary that Roosevelt won, Upton Sinclair, the socialist author, had run on a platform that included the release of Mooney as a key aim. However, Roosevelt didn't feel so much pressure upon his victory to assume this part of his defeated opponent's platform. After the tour, Mary Mooney returned to San Francisco, where she remained a familiar figure at labor demonstrations. However, she would never live to see her son's release. Mary Mooney died in September 1934 after a summer of labor unrest. One of her final public outings was when she walked in the San Francisco parade to honor longshoremen killed during the strikes in San Francisco that year. Speaking to the press, Anna Mooney, Mary's daughter, stated that the family attended the public funeral. Mother saw the funeral of the 2 men killed in the longshoremen strike and expressed the hope that the working classes might pay her some such last tribute. Such a funeral is Tom's wish too, Anna told the press. Tom Mooney, as you can see here in this picture on the right, he was not allowed to leave San Quentin to attend his mother's funeral. The funeral itself was a very grand occasion. It took place in San Francisco Civic Auditorium, and reports of an audience of up to 10,000 people were in attendance for Mary Mooney's funeral and her laying in wake. And she was placed beneath a banner that declared, "Mother Mooney, we will finish your fight." She was buried in Mount Tamalpais Cemetery in San Rafael, and on her way to her final resting place, the hearse stopped at the gates of San Quentin, but once more the warden refused Tom Mooney's request to be allowed to see it. Without Mary Mooney, of course, the campaigns continued on, with the Scottsboro mothers, including Mary Mooney's former traveling partners, Ada Wright and Viola Montgomery, continuing to take a prominent role. Another woman joined the campaign in the mid-1930s, interestingly, Ruby Bates, one of the original accusers of the Scottsboro boys, recounted her execution and joined the campaign calling for their release. And the international resonances of both the Mooney and Scottsboro campaigns continued to reverberate. In June 1935, Alvin Manfield Owsley was appointed US Minister to the Irish Free State. Arriving at Knightsbridge Station in Dublin, he was greeted by a military guard of honour, a brass band, and a group of protesters carrying signs that said, "No welcome for Owsley while Tom Mooney is unfree," and another placard declaring solidarity with the Scottsboro boys. In September 1939, Tom Mooney was finally pardoned by California Governor Olson. In the morning after his release, he visited his mother's grave. But the years of prison left Tom Mooney in a weakened state. Remembering Tom Mooney in his final years, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn wrote that it is wishful thinking and an evasion of reality to think for a moment that prison does not affect the political prisoner. It is designed not to assert, but to destroy human dignity. Tom died in March 1942, only a few years after his release, aged 59. He had been in his mid-30s when he was first imprisoned. And what became of the Scottsboro case? James Acker, in his account of the case, concludes that had the International Labour Defence, the Communist Link Group, not come to the aid of the Scottsboro Boys, and had not the US Supreme Court twice ordered new trials, 7 of the Scottsboro Boys, excluding the 2 youngest, almost certainly would have been killed. He notes that the 9 young men spent a total of more than 90 years behind bars for a crime that the state responsible for their convictions acknowledged decades later did not occur. By the late 1930s, the Scottsboro campaign had expanded its supporters and allegiances. When a 4th trial of Haywood Patterson began in January 1936, ACLU, the NAACP, the League for Industrial Democracy, and the Methodist group had all joined the defense. According to Jay Bellamy, who wrote an article on the case using records from the National Archives, in 1937, the state attorney shocked everyone in the courtroom when all charges were dropped against Olin Montgomery, Willie Roberson, Eugene Williams, and Roy Wright. Parole would be delayed for the other defendants, Patterson, Clarence Norris, Andy Rice, Ozzie Powell, and Charlie Weems. Bellamy notes that although all suffered from various problems on the outside, Roberson, Williams, Montgomery, and Weems eventually settled into everyday society and started new lives for themselves. Others had darker stories after parole, which remind us of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's statement of how prison breaks the prisoner. Others lived post-prison lives marked by violence and trauma, such as Haywood Patterson, who escaped prison and was arrested years later in 1950 after murdering a man in a barroom brawl, dying of cancer in prison, aged 39. Youngest of the Scottsboro defendants, Roy Wright, later murdered his wife and took his own life in 1959. Clarence Norris was the last surviving Scottsboro boy when he died in 1989, aged 76. In November 2013, the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles finally exonerated the last of the 3 Scottsboro boys who had not lived to see their exoneration. The 1932 Powell versus Alabama decision set a precedent to allow defendants the right to consult with their counsel, and Norris v. Alabama prohibited racial discrimination in jury selection. It is rare for a criminal prosecution to result in a landmark US Supreme Court ruling, notes James Acker. It is extraordinary for a case to recapture the justice's attention and inspire a second groundbreaking decision. The Scottsboro Boys not only set important legal precedents, it continues to attract scholarship and inspire books, films, and even a musical. Post for the musical seen here on the right, apparently did very well in terms of Tony Award nominations when it came out in 2011. A Scottsboro case is also often regarded as a key inspiration for the plot of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. And also in 2010, the Scottsboro Boys Museum and Cultural Center was established in Scottsboro, Alabama, to preserve the memory of the case. One of the most prominent activist alumni of the case was William Patterson, the San Francisco-born lawyer who accompanied Mary Mooney to meet President-elect Roosevelt in January 1933. On the right is a picture of the famed actor and performer Paul Robeson, presenting the UN in Paris with Patterson's famous text, "We Charge Genocide," his report charging the United States with contravening the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in its actions towards Black Americans. So that really brings me to my conclusion. And really, for me, the story is ultimately a tale about a truly remarkable 20th century campaign that sought to build a coalition across racial divides. As Miller, Pennybacker, and Rosenhoff note, only the anti-slavery struggle of the 19th century had enjoyed such global orchestration and empathy. And it's fitting that as part of this St. Bridget's Day celebration, on women disruptors in history, we remember a Mayo woman, Mary Mooney, and her important role within this global campaign. What does the story tell us about the broader history of the Irish in America? For me, I think the story stands out because it is exceptional. Throughout both the 19th and 20th centuries, African-American intellectuals and campaigners are often at best unsettled by their interactions with the Irish in America. The great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, speaking in 1849, found reason to decry how the, quote, Irish men newly landed on our soil who know nothing of our institutions, nor of the history of our country, whose toil has not been mixed with the soil of a country of ours, have the audacity to propose our removal from this, the land of our birth. Yet this story reminds us that divisions that Douglass pointed out that would later occur and live on in our own day, those divisions can be overcome, particularly within the context of a shared cause. The history of encounters between the Irish and African diasporas might be thought of as a history of invitations to join together in solidarity. Invitations often refused, but sometimes accepted. That's why I opened my talk with an advert in a 1921 Irish newspaper, in which a Caribbean radical told Irish readers how to imagine a new kind of coalition. The young radical who placed that advert, Cyril Briggs, went on to become part of the Scottsboro-Mooney campaign and sat in the US Supreme Court room as an elderly Mayo woman learned that new trials were being demanded for the Scottsboro boys. That moment and the wider tour reflected how an invitation for Irish and African Americans to join together in solidarity was accepted in years that saw the intensification of division across the world. And that acceptance saved lives. If I am to draw a kind of a one key thought of the story, then it is one already put simply by Cyril Briggs in his 1921 advert. Divided we fail, united we win. And on that very sentiment, I wanted to give the last word in this talk to Mother Mooney in a letter to Viola Montgomery in the summer of 1932. In that letter, Mary Mooney wrote, with millions of workers behind us, black and white and all other kinds, ready to fight for your boy and my boy and all other victims of the bosses, we will win this fight yet. Thank you very much.